Chapter 13 of The Ultimate Evil by Maury Terry. Minot? Why not? The call came March 2nd, 1979, the day after the article about unanswered questions in the 44 case appeared. He was a Yonkers teenager named Richard, the product of a good home, and he lived near Untermeyer Park and frequently took walks through the former estate's desolate, wooded confines and along the path of the aqueduct. I don't know if this has anything to do with the dead German shepherds you wrote about, but I found some too in the park, he told me, and I know there's a devil-worshipping group that's been meeting in there for quite a while. Richard had my attention. Not one word of suspected cult involvement in the case had reached the public. Where do they meet? I asked. There's an old pump house in the woods called the Devil's Cave. That's one place, and they also had an altar set up on the gutters. The gutters? I asked quickly. What do you mean, the gutters? The aqueduct. We call it the gutters or the sewers. You mean the kids who live around there call it the gutters? Yeah, if you come down, I'll even show you some graffiti with NGP written in a bunch of places. That means near gutters path around here. Really? They had an altar set up there on the gutters? Were the dogs nearby? Pretty close. A couple of my friends saw the group too. The next day, in the company of David Hartley, the youngish, soft-spoken editor and general manager of the Yonkers Herald-Statesman, I met Richard near the park's entrance on North Broadway, barely a mile north of Pine Street. He was a high school sophomore and a lanky, pleasant-looking youth. David Hartley himself was aware a cult had convened on the premises, but he didn't know I was looking for such a group until then. The student nurses and some doctors at St. John's Hospital, adjacent to the park, heard the chanting and saw the candles and torches around midnight last Halloween, and they'd heard them before that too, Hartley said. Security guards went down to the woods to the old pump house and saw them. The guards went back and called the cops, but by the time the police got here, the cult had scattered. But there was evidence left behind. Some candles and torches, Dave said, and I came up myself and found a hood and two capes. They left when they took off. The outfits, which I later saw, were gray in color, and consisted of a full peaked hood with slit eyes and two long capes or cowls. I saw them meeting too, Richard interjected, although not on that night. Two of my friends also spotted them. Let's check out the place, I said, and we entered the spacious, sprawling park. Passing through the restored section, which boasted fountains, gardens, and elaborate columns, a statuary, we walked down toward the river on a long, steep stone stairway known as the 1,000 Steps. At the bottom, on what was once a round open-air observation point with decorative columns, we turned to the right and groped our way through about 100 yards of muddy abandoned vineyard. Finally hidden in the dense shrubbery, we came to the Devil's Cave. Yeah, another water reference, I answered. They're all over the place in the Sam letters. The pump house was a circular structure about 30 feet in diameter that was built into the side of the hill. It was constructed of stone, and a small doorway allowed access to its dank interior. With flashlights to illuminate the gloom, we walked inside. I was stunned by what I saw. Built into the far wall was a long stone platform or bench which obviously served as an altar. For above and behind it, black painted pentagrams, a large inverted crosses, glared grotesquely from the wall in the light beams. To the right, a hideous red painting of the head of Satan appeared, and more inverted crosses, painted in black, leered from other strategic locations in the structure. On the ceiling, which was damp with moisture, there was a small rendering of the German SS Lightning Bolt insignia, along with the number 666, the sign of the great biblical beast of Revelation, a satanic symbol on one of the support columns in the center of the cave. An X-shaped figure with arrow points at the four ends was painted in black. It looks just like the SAM symbol, I said. The arrows are pointing out to the so-called four magical elements, earth, air, fire, and water. Each of those was alluded to in the Breslin letter. The pump house floor was dirt, and the stagnant air reeked of must and mildew. We've got to get photos of this, I said to Dave, but for now, let's get the hell out of here. This place is making me uneasy. Amen, he replied. Richard, who had stood by silently as we made our observations, then took us farther down the hill to the aqueduct itself. Through the still barren trees, the Hudson River shone brightly below, reflecting the dying orange sun, which was setting in the western sky over the Palisades. Walking the aqueduct path, Richard directed us to the site where he saw the wooden altar assembled. The supporting nails were still embedded in the two trees between which it was suspended. It was a long, wide board, and it hung there between the trees at about 4 feet off the ground. They had a wooden chair placed in front of it, he explained. Continuing down the path, he pointed out several spots adorned with the NGP graffiti, which he again said meant near Gutter's path. He next led us to 3 sites where he'd found dead German shepherds. 2 areas were approximate enough to the meeting scenes to appear significant. The third, where a rotted carcass still lay, was too far away to be definitely linked to cult activity. So this is the gutters and the sewers, I asked once more. That's what we call it, Richard replied. Lots of people who live along here, the young people, know it by those names. What's so important about the name? Not much, I'm just curious about it. It's a unique name for a place to have, I said, giving David Hartley a sideways glance. Richard then took us to meet 2 of his friends, both local teenagers. Each confirmed the NGP designation, and one said he'd witnessed a cult meeting one summer night from a safe distance. There were about 20 of them wearing hoods and carrying torches. They were standing in a circle and chanting something I couldn't understand. That's what the nurses saw and heard, Dave said, and Richard added a similar story, putting the number of cultists around 15 or 20. Dave and I then returned to the pump house alone, where he pointed out small red arrows painted on a series of trees which led up to the back of the hospital property. Some of them must have parked somewhere around the hospital and come in this way, he said. They had a trail marked so they could find their way in here at night. Quite an operation. Put a flashlight on the trees and you'll end up at the pump house, or you keep going down the aqueduct. You know, I said, it seems like a fair amount of people knew what was going on in here, but nobody knew the significance of it. About a year ago, Sal Diorio of the Sheriff's Department told me there were strong indications of cult activity somewhere in this area. Now I know what he meant. Then this must be the spot, Dave stated. Here and the aqueduct. Yes, I answered. The women of Queens are the prettiest of all. It must be the water they drink. That's the son of Sam Borelli letter, New York City drinking water. The pump house, Dave said, and the aqueduct. I nodded. And I've got a better one for you. Hello from the gutters of NYC, which are filled with dog manure, vomit, stale wine, urine, and blood. Hello from the sewers of NYC, which swallow up these delicacies. The Breslin letter, Dave cut in, which also signs off with in their blood, and from the gutters, I added. You've got them, don't you? Dave asked. We sure as hell do. As a conduit of water, an aqueduct was a gutter or sewer by definition. In this instance, it was literally the gutters of NYC, since it once carried drinking water to the metropolis, and because dog manure, vomit, stale wine, urine, and blood referred to the satanic Black Mass, that sentence of the Breslin letter meant Black Mass Aqueduct. The site was but a mile north of the Berkowitz and Carr homes, and one could walk the aqueduct path from Untermeyer Park to the Pine and Wicker Street sections, where the other dead shepherds were found, in a matter of 15 minutes. An adventurous individual with access could also travel that distance underground with difficulty through the old pipe itself. Chances were excellent that the Pine Street dogs carried in plastic bags were dumped there after rituals further up the path at Untermeyer Park. Putting the puzzle pieces together, there was physical and eyewitness evidence of the cult's existence, and the entire package, including symbols in the pump house, was linked to the Breslin letter in which Berkowitz and Marcy acknowledged word substitution clues were employed. Most important, the initial evidence was unearthed before Berkowitz said a word about the cult involvement. More than a year before, when Larry Siegel and I first deciphered the satanic clues in the Sam letters, we drew up a list of 3 items which separately or together could demonstrate the accuracy of what we uncovered. One of those required the discovery of evidence that Berkowitz or John Carr was in a cult. At Marcy, Berkowitz admitted to just that and added Michael Carr to the roster. A second step was to locate the cult itself and link it to Berkowitz and the Son of Sam case. That was now done, and the third step was to develop evidence independent of cult activity which demonstrated Berkowitz didn't act alone in the actual 44 incidents. We had made progress there. Besides, the already known inconsistencies concerning composite sketches and the like, but still had a distance to travel. Handwriting expert Charles Hamilton's analysis of the Sam letters provided a tremendous boost, but I intended to move on by conducting an in-depth investigation of the Moskowitz Violante shooting. It could be demonstrated Berkowitz wasn't alone at several crime scenes. The case would be stronger yet, but all we needed to do was to show evidence of a conspiracy in one shooting to topple the entire house of cards. Then all the divergent pieces of evidence would mesh, substantiate each other, and the truth would be undeniable. Before beginning the Moskowitz Violante investigation, I phoned Tony Catalano, manager of the Yonkers Animal Shelter, to learn if my count of the dead German Shepherds was accurate. It wasn't. More had been found subsequent to Berkowitz's arrest, in virtually the same spot on the aqueduct near Pine Street as the earlier 3. The first one was shot to death, Catalano told me. It was lying there alone. The other 2 were together. They were either strangled, shot, or poisoned. Because of the condition of the bodies, we couldn't tell, but they didn't walk off together and lie down side by side. They were murdered. He added that still another shepherd had been wounded in the immediate neighborhood. Its ear was sliced off. It wasn't chewed off like in a dogfight. It was a clean, even cut, like it was done with a knife. The toll of dead German shepherds stood at 10 at least, and 1 minus an ear was wounded. It was, I reasoned, time to explore the process a bit further. Besides the shepherds, a process link we had to consider: Berkowitz's Marcy statement that he believed he was protecting hundreds by remaining silent. If so, there was no doubt his alleged cult was part of a larger organization, one which likely had branches in different U.S. cities, branches such as those a process subset, probably with OTO crossovers, could have. Since the Sam letters contained so many clues, I went back to them and to other Berkowitz writings with which I was now familiar. Doing so revealed definite connections to process-like terms. For instance, Berkowitz had written he needed a message to Earth, and messenger was a process rank, as were father and master, both of which were allusions he made to Sam Carr and Craig Glassman. The Borelli letter contained the phrase "honor thy father," using British spelling of honor. The process was founded in Britain, as was Alistair Cronley's OTO chapter. I think he meant Crowley. Additionally, the Breslin letter said, "Now the void has been filled," and the bottomless void was definitely process terminology. That letter's return address in part said "blood and family," and the process had referred to itself as the family. Berkowitz signed a threatening letter to Glassman with brother, another process level, and he'd written HH on the envelope of one of the anonymous letters he mailed to Sam Carr. This, I would later learn, signified Heil Hitler, a process demigod. Regarding Hitler-process links, which also brought Fred Cowan into the fold, I would learn that an associate of Berkowitz's told police in 1977 that Berkowitz frequented the White Plains Road area of the northeast Bronx and possessed and wore Nazi insignia. Quote, in another 1977 police report, a witness stated that Berkowitz was seen in Manhattan with one Father Lars, who was said to be involved with some offbeat society, supposedly religious in nature. It was a process offshoot. Two other phrases closely associated with the process via Charles Manson were also used by Berkowitz. They were, "My children, I'm turning into killers," which was written on the wall of Berkowitz's apartment, and "Little ones," a phrase used by Berkowitz in a letter to Glassman. There were other illustrations of this orientation as well. Putting them together, along with the German Shepherds and Berkowitz's Marcy comments, I began to realistically believe that a process subset organization with OTO ties was involved in the 44 shootings. But I still wasn't willing to make the cult connection public. I hoped we could catch some members of the Yonkers group in the act and uncover more evidence of a conspiracy in the killing themselves. In the next few months, there were various developments in the case. Stacy Moskowitz's father, Jerry, called to thank Tom Bartley and me for the articles specifying the less than professional conduct of the Yonkers Police and Westchester Sheriff's Department in the local Berkowitz investigations. The Moskowitz family had filed a $10 million lawsuit against the Yonkers Police Department, charging negligence in Stacy's death. They would lose the suit. Before the articles appeared, they were ignorant of the sheriff's role in the case. I visited Jerry, his wife Nasa, and their daughter Ricky on a March Sunday and told them I seriously doubted Berkowitz shot Stacy. It was a difficult thing to say, but I was gratified the family trusted the analysis and said they'd stand by as I probed further. Nasa showed me Stacy's room and some personal effects and photos. She meant everything to us, Nasa said sadly. I hate Berkowitz with a passion, as you know. I was all over the place calling for his execution on the spot. But if he didn't do it, I just hope to hell you get the people who did. At his sentencing, Berkowitz, who was subdued when he pleaded guilty, threw the courtroom into turmoil by chanting, "Stacy was a whore," several times. The courtroom erupted and the sentencing was delayed. Berkowitz, I'd later learn, was motivated by two reasons. He wasn't ready to be sentenced in his mind, and he had developed an intense dislike for Nasa Moskowitz, who had loudly sought his execution. Berkowitz also knew something else. He hadn't shot Stacy. I went along with what the cop said, Jerry added, but I always knew he didn't look anything like the sketches, and I got to know a lot of the local police as a result of what happened, and a lot of them aren't convinced it was him either. On my way home that night, I drove by Pine Street and down the hill to Wicker and Warburton, from the home of the victim to the hangouts of the killers. I thought before slowly driving on, as hard as I tried to avoid emotional involvement in the deaths and the family sufferings, I wasn't always successful. That night was one of those occasions. I received another call in the wake of the articles. It had a familiar tone to it. The caller was an anonymous woman who began to tell me about a girl named Jane and a station wagon and Little Neck Bay and a successful accountant named Reeve Carl Rockman. Cut it out, Veronica. I know just who you are, I said. I was at your house last year, but you ducked under the bed. Go call Dunleavy. He could probably use a little excitement. Veronica Lucan was at first first aghast and immediately hung up the phone. An hour later, she called back apologizing for her actions of 1978 and admitted she had made a mistake. You sure did, lady, I told her. Lucan said her information about Staten Island's Meekin family was erroneous because she confused Mike Wallman, a friend of the Meehan's son, with Rockman. They look alike, and when I saw Wallman going in and out of that house, I thought it was Rockman. You were paranoid, Veronica. I'm sorry, but I thought Rockman was using another alias out there. He already uses aliases. Did you at least check that? Yes, we know he had 2 addresses in Queens and was calling himself Reeve Carl Rockman and Reeve T. Carl. But there's more to this. We interviewed Jane Jacqueline, and she's not dead at all, as you claimed she was. I was told she was murdered, Lucan insisted, and I even met her a few months before. Oh yeah? Then what did she look like? Lucan then described the woman other than the Jane Jacqueline and Midigar and I spoke to. Besides obvious appearance differences, the real Jane was the mother of an infant and would have been noticeably pregnant in June 1977 when Lucan said the meeting occurred. No, she wasn't pregnant, Lucan said, and her husband Arthur, who said he was present that day, came on the line and confirmed the details. People come to me, they confide in me, Lucan then explained. That's how I heard about the cult and Rockman. If you're leveling with me this time, that's a big if. Then whoever approached you used the real Jane's name, I said. And if anyone was murdered, it might have been the Jane imposter. Lucan then said that a New York City homicide detective was privy to the information and could vouch for its authenticity. She gave me the detective's name, and he called the next day. We arranged to meet for lunch at a restaurant on Central Avenue in Yonkers. In appearance, Bronx homicide detective Henry Hank Sinoni wasn't what I expected. Husky and about 6 feet tall with jet black hair, he sported a mustache and a prominent goatee. Wearing black clothes with a large gold crucifix draped around his neck, he looked more like an undercover vice narcotics cop than a homicide detective. His speech was classic New Yorkese. Sinodi was 37 and a 17-year police veteran who owned several departmental commendations. He was also very openly, devoutly religious, to a fault, some said, and acknowledged that he was a follower of Verona Lucan, an association he would later sever. Because of his ties to Lucan, I was openly skeptical of Sinodi, who insisted he investigated her claims and found that they had considerable validity. He revealed that in June 1977, 3 young women approached Lucan in a Queens restaurant and told her of a satanic cult which was involved in ongoing murders, apparently the son of Sam killings. The girl fingered Rockman as a leader of the group. One of the girls gave her name as Jane Jacqueline. The others introduced themselves as Wendy Smith and Nikki, who didn't offer a last name. The girl expressed fear of Rockman and said they wanted to escape the group's clutches. Lucan never saw Jane or Wendy, Sinodi said, but Nikki subsequently came to her and asked to be hidden out, claiming that the group was involved in the 44 case and that Jane had been slain and dumped into Little Neck Bay. Sinodi said that Lucan took Nikki and her residence on Van Duzer Street on Staten Island, where Nikki and a native Haitian remained for several weeks before flying back to her Caribbean homeland. I remembered the Meehans reported a black girl lived with Lucan during that period, so this part of the story seemed accurate. 2 days before Berkowitz's arrest, Lucan, who by then knew what Rockman looked like, claimed she spied him in an old station wagon in the company of a young man with dark curly hair. Lucan copied the car's license plate number and gave it to Sinodi, who showed me a dated computer printout, providing he ran the plate number that day, August 8, 1977. When Berkowitz was arrested on the 10th, Lucan claimed he was the man in the station wagon with Rockman. The car, the printout showed, was registered to a real Jane Jacklin. That's simply bizarre, I said to Sinodi. The real Jane admitted to Jim and me that she owned that car at the time, but said she knew nothing about any of this. Now, we did check with motor vehicles, and they told us the car was later junked at an auto wreckers in Queens. We checked that place and were told it went out of business in 1971, 6 years before. Aha, Sinodi said. Maybe Jane isn't involved at all. It could be her husband has some link to all of this. He was a laid-off New York City cop at the time, and anyone knew who Jane was could have used her name when talking to Lucan. I asked Sinodi what he knew about Rockman. He's a college-educated, no police record, divorced, and now remarried. He did some accounting work at a drug rehab center and had a dope problem himself at one time. He's also been under a psychiatrist's care, but we can't find out why due to the confidentiality factor. He's working now for a company on Wall Street, actually, at 2 Broadway. Number 2 Broadway, I asked. That's the building where one of the Sam victims worked, Christine Freund. Jesus, Sinodi exclaimed. Rockman works for Acme Limited. Who did she work for? Reynolds Security, I replied. That's probably a big building, but it's still a remarkable coincidence, and one of Rockman's addresses is in Forest Hills, only about 7 blocks from the Freund killing scene. What kind of car was he driving then, Hank? A small green Fiat. Well, at the time of the shooting, the cops had reports that a guy in a small green car dropped off another man at the railroad station there just a few minutes before the shots were fired. They never found the guys or the car. He's starting to look better than you, eh? Sinodi grinned. It's an interesting turn of events, I admitted, somewhat reluctantly. We had written Lucan off as a crackpot, and her Staten Island information was in fact garbage, and the real Jane wasn't killed. I'm not willing to say she really saw Berkowitz either. She was seeing conspirators everywhere, and Lucan made it all worse by refusing to talk to me. She's eccentric, Sinodi agreed, and she was scared. My interest in Rockman heightened further when I learned that a small business in Manhattan, located in a building where he once worked and his father still maintained an office, utilized Sam Carr's answering service in Yonkers. It was another unlikely coincidence. Rockman was born in 1947, was about 5'9", and had a medium build and straight, sandy-colored hair. He also had some type of defect or deformity on one of his fingers or thumbs, which caused him to favor the hand and discreetly shield the imperfection from others. When I discussed Rockman, Lucan, and Sinodi with Jim Midigar, I quickly discovered his appraisal of Lucan's credibility hadn't changed. The situation was worsened. On the night of Good Friday, when we planned a midnight stakeout of Untermeyer Park in hopes of spotting a cult meeting, an operation that the Yonkers police would attempt months later. That night, a small group of interested parties gathered at 10 p.m. in the home of Don Starkey, an arson investigator for the Yonkers Fire Department. Starkey had advised me that a series of more than 20 automobile arsons occurred in the general vicinity during Berkowitz's tenure on Pine Street, and that he received reports that a car similar to Berkowitz's, with 2 people in it on at least one occasion, was observed driving from a scene. Berkowitz had admitted he was a one-time firebug, and Starkey was also aware of Berkowitz's acknowledged complicity in the firebombings of the Carr, Nito, and Glassman homes. Also present at Starkey's house were Gannett, Tom Bartley, Midigar, and Sinodi. No one except me had met Sinodi before Hank arrived with 2 companions, wielding baseball bats, handed out religious medals, and began to discuss demonology and religious topics in a manner that caused Bartley to back out of the surveillance and convince Midigar half the world had gone totally crazy. Jim almost took the exit sign with Bartley, but I persuaded him to see the evening through. At 11:30 p.m. on a cloudy, moonless night, Starkey, Jim, Hank, his 2 companions, and I sneaked into the eerie darkness of Untermeyer Park. Jim insisted on letting Sonodi and his friends lead the way. Somebody could get shot or beaten to death tonight, Jim warned. I don't like this at all. Somebody might shoot first and worry about it later. I got enough problems. I don't need something like this on top of them. Don Starkey was also on edge. If anyone's meeting here, I just want to observe them. I'm not looking for any confrontation, he emphasized. For 90 minutes we searched the woods near the pump house and walked along the aqueduct. Each time an animal stirred in the bushes, we froze expectantly. Then shortly after 1 a.m. it began to rain heavily and we abandoned the stakeout. Never again, Jim said later. Not under those circumstances. I don't give a shit if Charlie Manson himself was going to be slitting a dog's throat. I just don't know how Hank and those guys he brought would react. Jim, already skeptical of Verona Lucan, as I was, now echoed Tom Bartley's distrust of Sonodi. My own faith in the detective wavered, and for several months I didn't speak to him. Our investigation of Rockman also ceased. In April, I testified at Jim's pretrial hearing at Senate Supreme Court in Brooklyn, where I repeated my limited knowledge of the post-Midigar-Clark Berkowitz relationships. Since the Gannett Westchester newspapers were now involved in the investigation, they sent a reporter to cover the hearing, as did other New York City media, but not the Post. In my testimony, I referred to John Carr and the conspiracy hunt, as did Jim, and our comments were reported by the press. We were still trying to get the message out. One cross-examination prosecutor, Tom McCloskey, thought he'd make a big point about clandestine operations by demanding to know if I attended the Marcy interview. Until he saw me in court, I don't believe he knew it was me by name who participated in the Berkowitz interrogation. McCloskey attempted to suggest I'd somehow cloak and daggered my way into the maximum security facility. I managed to deflect his allusions by answering, "You know, I was at Marcy, Tom. We saw each other there, remember?" McCloskey immediately dropped the subject. Also, that spring, Michael Carr, who had blossomed into a top suspect, although he didn't know it, naively sent a press release to the Yonkers Herald-Statesman. Editor Dave Hartley, who didn't publish it, forwarded the item to me, dated April 29th. It said, Carr's Telephone Answering Service Incorporated is happy to announce the return of Michael Vale Carr III, BBC MCOS, its Secretary, Organization Executive Secretary, from the Flagland Base, a religious retreat maintained by the Church of Scientology of California in Clearwater, Florida, after completion of the executive delegation and supervision course. By now, cognizance of the process had sprung from Scientology, which called itself a church, but functioned as a large self-realization cult with its own intelligence operatives. I called Midigar to relate the news to him. Scientology had run into legal difficulties with the Justice Department and was suspect of fostering illicit smear tactics in a number of cities, including Clearwater, Florida, scene of Michael Carr's sabbatical. That confirms what we heard about Michael and John Carr's death. I said to Jim, he's a ranking Scientologist, and regarding the process, maybe the apple didn't fall too far from the tree. Yeah, and maybe some of the apples climbed back into the tree, Jim suggested. If he's counseling lost souls for Scientology, allegedly helping them discover themselves, he could certainly be working both sides of the street and plucking a few out for recruitment in the Satan stuff. The Scientology movement is fertile ground for latching on to confused people. He'd have his pick of candidates. Even that press release sounds like some recruitment gimmick. It's certainly got nothing to do with answering telephones. Not on the surface, at any rate, I cautioned. We'll have to wait and see if it's the apple and the tree, or if he's using his Scientology position for other reasons. In May, I received word from a source that Berkowitz's life was in danger. I immediately phoned Jim, who contacted Felix Gilroy. Gilroy sent a formal advisement to the correction department, warning that reliable informants said an attempt might soon be made on Berkowitz's life. It happened at about 8:15 a.m. on the morning of Tuesday, July 10th. Berkowitz, in a segregated Attica cell block reserved for high-security risk prisoners, was carrying a pail of hot water as part of his inmate's job as a porter when the razor slash came. The cut, which caught Berkowitz from behind, extended from the left side of his throat to the back of his neck. It required 56 stitches to close. A bit deeper and he would have been dead. Berkowitz, with typical aplomb, walked up to a correction guard and said, "I'm sorry, but I've been cut." He was taken to the infirmary for treatment and refused to cooperate with prison officials in their investigation. He never revealed the name of his assailant, who was another inmate. Writing about the incident to a friend, Berkowitz blamed his inattention and lack of concentration on an occult book he'd been reading. He wrote, "There were other things. I wasn't sleeping well and I was tossing and turning. I was losing sleep and I walked around all day feeling tired. There were still more things, but I can't pinpoint it other than saying I was getting a bad feeling in general and bad vibes from everybody else. I admit that I did get somewhat enmeshed in this book and often spent hours inside its pages. However, everything was happening so subtly, so slowly, that I never connected the book to this. Maybe it wasn't the book, but just a very common stroke of bad luck. Anyhow, everything culminated with my throat being slashed. I could well have lost my life, yet it didn't upset me. After the assault, I was sent to an isolation room at the hospital, being locked alone in that airless room, that solitary, soundless room. I started to think and meditate about the close brush with death and everything that led up to it. And the last rotten, depressing month, finally, I put two and two together. I was getting these negative feelings from this book all along. If you could have seen this book, then you'd understand. It was full of satanic symbols, prayers, and most of all, pictures. Do you know someone by the name Eliphas Levi? He had this picture drawn up. It was a picture of a goat head attached to the body of a man. It was called Baphomet. I did stare at this picture for hours on end. In the hospital room, I slept and slept. I realized that I had gotten careless. I wasn't alert. So out comes the razor blade and swoosh. Immediately upon my return to my own cell a week later, I went straight to my bunk, kneeled down underneath it, grabbed the book, and tore it into shreds. Although I can't say with certainty that the attack on Berkowitz was linked to my source's information, it's definitely possible it was given the timing of the incident. Although Berkowitz would later imply another motive, the motive, according to a prison source, involved Berkowitz's cult activities. Nonetheless, a chagrined Gilroy told the press that he'd formally alerted the correction department weeks before that an attack might be imminent, but only then, in the aftermath of the assault, were security measures around Berkowitz increased. As word of the attempted murder was flashed, we were in the final stages of preparing a major report on the Moskowitz killing for the Gannett Westchester Rockland newspapers, WRN. For 6 weeks, with help from Jim Midigar and Tom Bartley, I probed that shooting. We re-interviewed witnesses, Tommy Ziano, who saw the attack from his borrowed blue Corvette, and located and extensively questioned Cecilia Davis, whose complete account of what happened that night had never reached the public. With stopwatches and multiple recreations and other analysis of the events of July 31st, 1977, a picture emerged which demonstrated, as I'd long suspected, that Berkowitz wasn't alone at that scene, and apparently wasn't the triggerman either. The article, which occupied more than an entire page in the large formatted newspapers, was published on Thursday night, July 19th. This time, the editors allowed Jim's name on the story, and he and I shared the byline. Whereas the March article, which raised a number of conspiracy-related questions, was largely ignored by the rest of the media, this one wasn't. TV and radio covered the story, and the Associated Press released a dispatch written by Richard Rick Piniak, who'd been following our investigation since interviewing Midegar 9 months earlier. Piniak had urged us to publish John Carr's suspected link to the case, but we demurred, waiting for more information before doing so. Not surprisingly, law enforcement officials denied the article's revelations, which were far less extensive than the later details that appear in this writing. WCBS radio reporter Irene Cornell sought out Brooklyn's DA Eugene Gold, who refused to speak with her, but hollered that the article was wild speculation. As he ducked into an elevator, WPIX-TV sent reporter Jeff Kamen to Gold's office for comment, but he was denied access. WPIX would follow the case closely from then on and air extensive coverage of future developments. Gold, under pressure, finally released a statement which my colleague Mike Zuckerman reported in the next day's editions of the Gannett papers. The statement charged that his own star witnesses were in error. The story, Gold's office said, was a wild hypothesis, not supported by the evidence. Gold, his spokeswoman, Rhonda Nager, admitted, hasn't read the story, but he knows of its contents. Then Nager requested that the following comment not be attributed to her by name. It was night, it was dark, and at the very best the witnesses' recollections are hazy, and those recollections could be marred by the intensity of the experience. The DA's office was now trying to destroy the credibility of its own key witnesses, whom the police believed and upon whom much credit was bestowed at the time of the arrest. The Moskowitz report drew the battle lines. Gold was going to stonewall for as long as he could get away with it. And because the article concerned Gold's jurisdiction, Queens DA John Santucci and the Bronx Mario Merola remained silent. The NYPD issued a soft public denial, but was clandestinely operating on a different level. Regarding the press, it was enlightening to gauge the current reaction to new developments in the case that originally was such a media spectacular. The wire services and most TV radio stations, who were not in direct competition with their print counterparts, paid some attention to the story. The New York Times published a small piece reporting our allegations and the official denials. The Daily News, which unfortunately had a stake in the soul killer concept, ignored the issue. This was the same publication that, along with the Post, had embellished the Son of Sam story as its own 2 years earlier. News columnist Jimmy Breslin, with TV sports reporter Dick Schaap, had penned a novel about the 44 case which depicted Berkowitz as a drooling, demented madman who acted alone. Additionally, the News, which had posted reward money for the apprehension of the Son of Sam, presented some of that booty to, of all people, the Carr family. So the News, whose reporter William Federici was involved in the jumbling of Mrs. Davis's original story, would treat the hunt for accomplices as if it didn't exist. It would be several years before management changes restored the paper's traditional lifeblood. The Post, with problems of its own regarding the Midegar case, which was about to come to trial, also ignored the Moskowitz article. But later, at the urging of Steve Dunleavy, who was well aware of the subject's validity, the Post covered the conspiracy probe. Once we'd broken ground, the New York area press might have made a positive impact by transcending the reporting of charges of denials to mount serious inquiries to complement ours. But it wasn't to be, and there were several reasons why we effectively had to go it alone. First, there was a combination of incredulity and embarrassment. Except for the Post, which dropped out due to circumstances described earlier, no one had looked behind the headlines after Berkowitz's apprehension. reluctant to consider that they might have missed a story of such dimensions. Some publications simply accepted the official renunciation as gospel. Second, no media outlet likes to play catch up, and all were unknowing of the sources and leads we had developed. So rather than start from scratch in the middle of a labyrinth or continually publish credited versions of the Gannett pieces, some editors simply disregarded the news developments. Third, since the press relies on official agencies for material, it can have inherent motives for generally assuming a non-combative posture with the likes of police departments and district attorneys' offices, a position that would have been severely compromised by pursuit of the Sam case. Concurrently with the days of Watergate-type investigative reporting in the wane, much to the dismay of the reporters and editors, a fair number of media executives, including the then top editors of the Daily News, were actively seeking to shed their watchdog cloaks and rekindle amiable relationships with government branches. We ourselves didn't relish a battlefield setting for the Son of Sam investigation. We had made official visits before publishing a word about John Carr or the Moskowitz murder, but when it became evident that authorities wouldn't follow through, we determined that they could read about our findings at the same time everyone else did. But the Gannett staff, Midigar and I, were basically satisfied with the response to the Moskowitz story. The message was out. There were big problems with the Son of Sam case, and there would be no turning back. In Minot, North Dakota, far from New York's subterfuge, Jeff Neese, 26, a reporter and native Ridgewood, New Jersey, was scanning the overnight AP wire at the Minot Daily News when he saw the dispatch about the Moskowitz story and its conclusion that Berkowitz wasn't alone in the 44 shootings. Neese's mind immediately clicked on to John Carr. Neese wasn't working in North Dakota when Carr died 17 months earlier, but his paper's current police reporter, But as his paper's current police reporter, he'd heard stories of Carr's links to Berkowitz from various Minot and Ward County police officers, connections that were unknown by us in New York. Twice in the months after Carr's death, I phoned Dakota authorities only to be turned away, and the New York officials had slammed the lid on us in the East. But Neese, who dealt with the Dakota officers daily, knew explosive facts which had been kept from us. He phoned Gannett's main office in White Plains and reached Tom Bartley, who told him I was en route to Fire Island, but would be checking back with him 4 days later. Neese and I established contact. There's a lot of information on John Carr out here, Jeff said. They know he was involved with Berkowitz and belonged to a satanic cult. They sent it all to New York before Berkowitz pleaded guilty, but it was squelched back there. What? I was incredulous. We were after him since before his death, and they closed us down. Now you're saying they knew he was tied to Berkowitz all along? Exactly, Neese emphasized. And the cult too? Yeah, they got it all right after Carr died. Jeff, you'd have no way of knowing this, but we saw Berkowitz 9 months ago and he confirmed knowing Carr, and he said there was a cult, too. Now I heard that the cops out there uncovered the same things long before we talked to Berkowitz. Damn it, confirmations of everything existed all along. Berkowitz's statements were confirmed before we even met him. They didn't really cover it up out here, Jeff said. They sent it all to New York. Okay, but don't you see there's no debate on this anymore? Both Carr and Berkowitz admitted to knowing each other, and there's cult evidence on both ends. We've got it. Neese began filling in the blanks over the next 2 weeks. The scope of what had been hiding about John Carr was unveiled to me. The information was stunning. Finally, I told Jeff I needed to talk with one of the officers involved in the Carr investigations. 3 more days elapsed before Neese persuaded Lieutenant Gardner to Terry Gardner of the Ward County Sheriff's Department to speak with me. It was Gardner who was quoted in the Post story about Carr's death and said to the Dakota investigation was complete. Gardner was initially suspicious and several conversations ensued before he began to open up at all. When he did, he put Minot police officer Mike Knoop on an extension. Knoop, who'd done undercover work in Minot's drug culture, had himself developed information about Carr. Hell yes, Gardner said. We said the investigation was done. We didn't owe those papers in New York a thing. Some of them thought they were God Almighty because they were from New York, and we didn't take too well to that. In the second place, we were asked to keep it quiet by the Westchester Sheriff's Department because they told us there was a confidential investigation going on. We asked you to keep it quiet, and what did you do? I asked. The investigator's name was Kyle Zajac, and he said they had a case going on with John Carr and the son of Sam. Yeah, thanks to us they did, I said. They didn't know shit until I told them. You told them? Gardner was surprised. Yeah, and before them, we went to the Brooklyn DA's office. Well, we forwarded everything we found to Westchester, Gardner said. We couldn't believe we never heard from anyone in New York after that. It just died. Someone back there called our sheriff because we kept looking into it and told us to forget it. You're aware they then ignored what you people dug up and let Berkowitz plead guilty as a lone killer 3 months later? Yeah, we were surprised there wasn't any follow-up, but what could we do? New York had a Son of Sam case, not us, Mike Knoop said. That's right, Gardner added. I'm certain they figured that Carr was Berkowitz's accomplice and he was dead, so they couldn't prosecute him, and to let this out would have blown the whole case against Berkowitz out of the water. All his confessions, everything would go up in smoke. Was Carr in a cult? I asked. Yeah, said Gardner. He was a culty, and he was involved with Berkowitz. We interviewed a lot of his friends and looked into his life pretty good at the time. There was a lot of dope dealing out here, too, Knoop cut in, and old John Carr was up to his neck in it. Do either of you guys know Carr's nicknames? I asked. Sure, Gardner said. JC was one of them and Wheaties was another. Where'd you get that? His girlfriend, Linda O'Connor, and his drug counselor, Gardner said. That's a big piece of information, gentlemen. Berkowitz told us John Carr was John Wheaties. Sure, Knoop agreed. They knew each other. We got that, too. The evidence compiled in North Dakota was so compelling I immediately pulled out all the stops in New York to learn just what official agencies were aware of the information. Sal Diorio of the Westchester Sheriff's Department, which apparently ran interference for the Brooklyn DA's office, said all the information the department received was forwarded to Brooklyn DA Eugene Gold in a matter of days. Technically, the Sheriff's Department was blameless, but in effect it ducked the Son of Sam responsibilities on jurisdictional grounds and laid the accountability on Brooklyn. They were prosecuting the Son of Sam case, Diorio said. We passed everything we uncovered on to them. At no time did anyone in Westchester Sheriff's Department advise me that important information confirming the John Carr, Berkowitz, and cult suspicions I had originated had been unearthed in North Dakota. And neither, of course, did Gold's office in Brooklyn without any follow-up investigation, as Gardner and Knoop said. The Brooklyn DA who kept Queens and apparently the Bronx in the dark. Sat back and allowed Berkowitz to plead guilty as the sole killer in early May 1978, and this was the agency that already knew about the VW chase. Our information about Carr and a cult and Mrs. Davis's statements about Berkowitz's Galaxy leaving the area shortly before the Moskowitz Violante attack. Queens District Attorney John Santucci would later remark the information about Carr never reached this office. 544 attacks occurred in my jurisdiction, and I was uncomfortable with the entire case since the arrest had been urging a trial, but couldn't convince the other district attorney, Gold and Mario Marella, who were willing to accept the guilty pleas. If I was aware of the car's information, I would have acted on it then. I only wish you'd come to me instead of Brooklyn, but you had no way of knowing what was going to occur either. Indeed, 18 months had elapsed, and only now I was learning what really happened after John Carr's death. When Carr's body was found the night of February 16, 1978, he was in fact termed a probable homicide victim, not the suicide as later told to the Post, said Gardner. At the time, we didn't really know what happened. We eventually called it an apparent suicide, but we never really closed the case. If information was later found... Oh my goodness. I'm going to have to call it. I'm tired. We'll pick this up tomorrow.